we had a cancellation, and Jim Treisler very graciously agreed to speak. And this is his bio. James Treisler has been the Director of Education at the Virginia War Memorial since October 2015. He currently serves as historian on the board of the Battle of the Bulge Association. In the past, he has served on the board of the Genealogical Research Institute of Virginia. He has a degree in political science from East Carolina and a master's degree in education from VCU. For 25 years, Jim taught social studies in Virginia and was a recipient of numerous awards. He was the 2007 Chesterfield County Teacher of the Year and the Virginia State Region 1 Teacher of the Year. It's very impressive. Jim is passionate about history, education, and enjoys presenting to students of all ages. Now, I am really excited about this program, and I hope you are too. The lecture is called Mail Call, Mail Delivery from World War II. In March 1944, Sophia Socha wrote to her husband, "I can't believe it took a war for me to realize how much I love you." From censorship to V-mail, this lecture will look at letters from the home front and the battlefield. What were the rules of censorship, and how did soldiers try to circumvent those rules? Who were the ladies of the 6888 Central Post Battalion? This lecture will both entertain and touch your heart. No one wants to miss Mail Call. So I hope some of this is familiar to you, some of what I've read. And Jim, off to you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Ooh, that's loud, sorry. Many of you may know Deborah Marks that lives in this region. I was one of her teachers for many years in Chesterfield County. So anyhow, it's great to be here today. Like you, I'm also disappointed that Karen Chase is not here today. Karen is a wonderful presenter, and she has presented several times for us at the Virginia War Memorial. And she called and said, Jim, I've seen you present to the DAR. Would you please come fill in for me since I'm unable to be here on the 10th? And of course I said, yes, I would be here. So Karen is visiting her parents up in Canada right now. So and both her parents have been sick. So that's why she couldn't be here today. I have had the opportunity to interview close to 200 World War II veterans and read perhaps 5,000 to 8,000 original World War II letters. And this is because two things mainly. My father-in-law was a Battle of the Bulge veteran, and around 2005 he said, "Why don't you come to the reunions with me?" And I said, "Sure." So I started going to reunions all over the country. And I met lots and lots of World War II veterans and heard their stories. Well, about the same time, I was teaching a class at Clover Hill High School in Chesterfield, and we received a box of letters that I purchased on eBay that came from Mrs. Socha, who, again, was just quoted about, "I can't believe it took a war for me to realize how much I love you." And one of my students, I said, let's start a project with World War II letters. And one of my students said, well, let's call it "It Took a War" after Mrs. Socha's quote in that letter. So we did. We started a website, and we started acquiring more and more letters. We transcribed those letters. And I remember going to my principal at the time and saying, we're going to start a project that's going to be a 10-year project. And she looked at me and said, oh, you won't even be here in 5 years. Well, that project went 16 years and won an award from the History Channel called a Save Our History Award. So I'm very proud of my students. It's a reflection of all of their hard work and their vision. And the end result is we've spent basically most of the last now 21 years focusing on World War II topics, meeting people from World War II, reading their letters, and it's really been an exciting 20 years for me getting to know these people. Many of them, as you know, we've lost. The last government estimate I saw, and this was about half a year ago, was that 1.5% of our World War II veterans were still living. You can imagine with COVID and other problems that may be below 1% now. 16 million men and women served in uniform during the war, so I'll let you do the math, but it's well below 1 million that are still alive with us today. So Let's talk about the mail a little bit, and I think I may have, yeah, I need to talk about the War Memorial too. I worked for the Virginia War Memorial. I left teaching. I had a very successful teaching career. My students were very successful, and I was incredibly proud of that. I'll tell you a little trick that worked for me in the classroom. They used to write essays for me, and they'd write in a manner that they wanted to get a grade for me. And I got so tired of that. So finally, I started setting up my essay assignments at the beginning of the year. And I said, you're going to write for museums and places all over the country, and you get to pick whatever you're interested in. So it might be the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library, or the Emmett Shalom Holocaust Cemetery, or the National World War II Museum. And they would pick topics, and now they were writing for places well beyond me. And it changed the teacher-student dynamic, that I became their mentor and guided them through these essays that were sent around the country. To show the results, the last 4 years I taught, my students won $13,000 for their homework. Okay? They're building their resume to get into college by saying, I was a finalist, or I won a state or national essay competition. So it really changed the dynamics of them trying to please me with a grade. So anyhow, I was doing very well at the school, but then the War Memorial said, you know what, you're doing a lot of cool things on the local level. We want you to do it statewide. And that's why I moved on to the War Memorial. So this is the Virginia War Memorial. Not only is it a memorial, it's a museum. We have wonderful galleries, and it's an education center. We do programs all the time. As a matter of fact, last night I was in Mechanicsville at the VFW talking about a different aspect of World War II. And yesterday morning we did a live stream with an individual, a PhD from Mississippi, on the Purple Heart, because this past weekend was Purple Heart Day. So we are constantly educating people and doing programs on history. So that's the War Memorial. And those two shrines recognize the close to 12,000 Virginians that have died in combat at the hands of the enemy since 1941, when Pearl Harbor was attacked. So every city, every county is represented here at the War Memorial. This is our shrine of memory, and that's the sunrise coming up along the James River. And she represents all the women who have lost loved ones to war. And this is looking through part of our glass shrine. One side is glass, the other side is stone. And those are some of the names. They're alphabetical, by not only by county and city, but also individuals within the county and city. So our mission is to honor veterans, preserve history, educate youth, and inspire patriotism in all. So today I'm going to honor those veterans who served during World War II. I'm going to work to continue to preserve history, and you'll be happy to know that I'm educating youth. So I hope you're feeling even better that you're my youth group today. And we're going to hopefully feel patriotic when we leave here. I bet you feel pretty patriotic already, I can tell. So, mail during World War II. I want to start out, I know it's a little hard to see, but here in the center is Private William Roberts, right there, Jr., and he's with the 80th Infantry Division. And I want to start out looking at one of his letters, because there's some key, oh, that helps a lot, thank you. There's some key pieces of his letter. Now, he's writing to his wife, my darling wife, on December 2nd, 1944. This is just a few weeks before, exactly 2 weeks before the Battle of the Bulge begins, which is that surprise German attack in Western Europe. And, you know, there were rules. We're going to look at the rules of censorship here in a moment. But here he's saying, you know, my darling wife, how are you by now? Sugar, he called her Sugar a lot, okay? Sugar, I am okay, I suppose. Sugar, it is very unusual for me to get to write 2 days right straight along. But every chance I get, you can bet I will let you know I'm still okay. And that was the big thing. They wanted to get a letter sent just to let them know, I'm thinking of you, and I'm still alive, I'm doing okay. And really beyond that, they couldn't say a whole lot because of the censorship rules. Now he says, Sugar, I received a very pretty Christmas card from Dr. John Lane. And one of the important things was, they're starting to think about Christmas mail in November, you know, because it's going to take several weeks. You know, some air mail back then, but a lot of mail went by ship. And then we're going to talk about V-mail also, which was mail that was filmed, and the film was sent across. But they're thinking about Christmas and trying, on the home front, we're trying to get those packages in the mail as early, close to December 1st as we can, in hopes that they will find our soldiers overseas by Christmas. So, sugar, I hope you will have just as, let me back up, I don't think I read the yellow. It sure makes anybody feel good to get mail over here. In fact, that is all you have to look forward to. And I think that's important to realize. For most of these soldiers, if they had a choice between receiving mail from home and eating, they would choose mail over eating. I mean, they really wanted to hear from home. And the Battle of the Bulge that's going to start on December 16th is going to really foul up the mail. This is the largest land battle that the United States ever participated in. And the mail is going to get so backed up, but we're going to see that toward the end of my presentation. So he goes on and says, sugar, I hope you will have just as nice a Christmas as is possible for you too. And maybe by next Christmas, if nothing happens, we will be together as we can enjoy things as we used to. Until that time, we'll both just have to make the best of it, as so many are doing. The important thing to remember is they served for the duration. So when you went in the military, you did not know when the person would be back. One of the letters that I love that we read, written in 1943, the soldier says, I really want to take you to the movies, and I hope to be home by 1947 to do it. Okay? So, but it is funny to look at, but for him, that was a reality. Because, nobody knew that the atomic bomb was going to be developed, and we were planning on doing invasions in Japan even into 1946, landing troops in March of 46. So when he said, I might be home by 1947, that was very realistic for him to say that, So he finishes up this letter by saying, and that's the actual letter pictured there, by saying, I got a letter from Rebecca saying that Quentin is still in England. It would be fine if it could all end before he gets any closer to the front. So he's worried about someone in his family. And he says, sugar, so far as I haven't gotten any of the boxes that you or anybody else have sent, but that is to be expected at a time like this. Sugar, as I have very little to write about today, I will close. You just keep right on smiling and don't worry, because it can't last always. So again, stressing that he's expecting packages from home and they are not showing up, okay? Which is a problem. Now, when this would happen for a while, most of the soldiers sensed there was a problem somewhere in the line of delivery, but they also start wondering, there's that little voice in the back of your head, do they still love me? Why aren't they writing every day? They must be writing every day, but you don't know. You can't just pick up the phone and call and find out. So that's a problem when the mail doesn't come. Or when the clicker doesn't click. There it is. And this is what the outside of his envelope looked like. And I wanted to share a few features with you. One is, soldiers typically had their mail for free. But if you wanted airmail, you did have to pay for it. So this is a 6 cent, and that was very expensive, right? 6 cents for airmail. And it was 3 cents for regular mail at that point in history. And up here, he would put his return address. Let me see if I can do the, there we go, I think. Oh well, I thought I saw it for a second, but I'll play Vanna White for a minute. Up here we have the return address, Company D, 319th Infantry, APO 80, Postmaster, New York, New York. And you know why they did that, right? He's not in New York, but if you were in North Africa or Europe, you had a New York post office so that if the enemy captured the mail, they wouldn't know where you were. And the government knew at that time where APO 80 was located. They knew, as long as they knew, the mail would get through. If it was heading out to the Pacific Theater, APO San Francisco was typically the mail that was, the address that was used. So here's the cancellation of the stamp showing December 4th, 1944, and addressed to his wife there in Nashville, Tennessee. This is important down here. It means the censor has read it and approved everything. There was nothing cut out of that letter. And he put his stamp and his signature on it. Now, the censor was usually a lieutenant, an officer that would read the mail. From the veterans I've interviewed, some read the mail very thoroughly, and some said, well, I just trusted my men to do the right thing, and they just passed that mail on. Because think about it, if you're away from your loved ones, and especially, if you have romantic feelings for that person, do you really want your lieutenant reading about your emotional feelings? You don't. And the one censor I talked to said he absolutely didn't want to know about the romantic feelings that his soldiers had for their loved ones. So he just kind of rubber stamped those letters. Here is a little mini book that one of my interns put together, and we did an activity with students that just showed how you could look up the APO addresses. And what's important is you combine the number of the APO address, which was 80 for us, and the date, and the postmark was the 4th of December, 1944. So if we come over here, this was the list of all the places that the 80th Infantry had been. And so this is all APO 80. And these are the dates when they arrived at different places. So if we come down the list, like right about here, here's November 20th, they're in I don't speak French, but Lucy, it looks like France. And then they work their way down. And here's December 2nd, 1944. They are in St. Avold, okay? So that's where they're located. But see, only the government knew this. This was, declassified after the war. So the enemy would have done anything to have this list back during the war. So they're in St. Avold, France, when he writes this letter and mails it. Now, what I want you to see is here's a map showing, here's Metz. I know my father-in-law was in the artillery with 155 howitzers, and he was in Metz for a while. But here's St. Avold is over here, and the Lorraine American Cemetery and Memorial is located there today. So he's in St. Avold, right there. Now, I went to the military reports to see what was going on at the time he was writing this letter in St. Avold. Remember, he said, not a lot to write about, not a lot going on, sugar, So here we go, and we look, and this is the report, the military report. The city of St. Avold was captured on Sunday, the 27th of November, so just a few days before he writes this letter on December 2nd. Lieutenant Schlund is writing this report. He arrived at 10 o'clock in the morning with the first wave of doughboys who entered the town. Carrying the name of a reliable informer who lived in St. Avold, Schlund found him, and consequently he learned considerably. It seems the last of the Germans had fled close to midnight the night of November 26th to 27th, but not without doing considerable damage with demolitions. About 6 enemy engineers had placed heavy charges under the town post office, the main crossroad, and a culvert in the town square, in addition to several other relatively important crossroads and culverts within the city. So he's in a town where they're going around trying to find all these booby traps and bombs that the Germans have left, but he's writing to Sugar and saying, everything's great, Sugar. So it's interesting to see what's really going on. He couldn't write this in the letter, but that's what the report showed that was going on at that time. This is just a picture so you can see it of the military cemetery. So there it is in St. Avold. Okay, I'm going to try this. Or, even better, how about that? Here's some instructions for writing letters. Write briefly and often. It was better just for them to hear that you were doing okay and thinking about them. Write on only one side of the paper, and that was because of censorship requirements. When you cut out a word, it happens to cut out both sides of the paper. So some soldiers learned that the hard way. Address the mail properly. Your rank, company, assignment, or other unit. Include that APO address, and always use your return address. And then for the home front, they told wives and loved ones to write about the things he wants to hear about. Family, sports. Don't complain about things he can't help you with. So if the car's broken down and he's away at war, don't tell him the car broke down. Tell your neighbor the car broke down so your neighbor and your family can help you. But don't tell him, because all he's going to do is agonize and want to be home with you, right? So you don't tell him. One of the series of letters that we're going to look at today, I loved it. And I don't know if the wife liked baseball or not, but she listened to almost the entire 1942 World Series on the radio so that she could write home and tell what was going on to her husband who loved baseball. So it's really interesting, That's what my wife would have had to do, because I love baseball too. So this one is one of my favorite letters, and High school students especially, one of the ways I like to attract them or hook them with World War II is to think about relationships. You know, do you remember being in high school and thinking, gosh, that Susie is so cute, should I ask her out? Well, now think about this. You know, here are these people that some of them have been dating, some of them maybe you want to date, some are thinking about getting married, and now you're going away for the duration. Do we date? Do we get married? If we're married, do we have a child? The pressure on relationships is enormous at this point in time. One letter that I don't include today that was written by the Thompson family, I don't know why, but this one letter really struck my heart. It was a basic letter. She was writing to him, just talking about normal everyday things, and about 3/4 down the page, she had one sentence that just pierced my heart. We are not to be parents. And then she went on from there. So, you know, he was gone to war, but they were hoping that they would have a child, and it didn't happen. So, fortunately, he came home from the war, but, you know, that was 3.5 years later. This is a great one. This is Sid Wells. Some of you may have known Colonel Sid Wells. He lived in Chesterfield. He's been deceased now for, gosh, I bet you 10 years probably. And he wrote a letter the day after Pearl Harbor. He was engaged to be married, and he was already in the Army when Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7th, 1941. So on the 8th, he sat down and he wrote this letter to his fiancée. And he said, "Darling, I saw something today that I will remember as long as I live. There were about 30 or 40 of us laying around or sitting around the pay room listening to the president's speech. When it was over, they played the Star-Spangled Banner. You should have seen that room. As a single man, we all rose to our feet and stood at attention. Every back was still and every chin was firm and not a word was spoken. And in some eyes there were tears of emotion." He goes on. "I'm going to do my best to try and get a furlough," and that's they liked each other a lot. I mentioned they were engaged. That is actually Sid Wells and his, he called her Red. She had red hair. So that's Sid and Red. Her name was Ann, I believe. And he said, "I'm going to do my best to try and get a furlough and get home to see you. It probably will be the last one we'll get for a long time. I'm going to try and get it for New Year's Eve. Pray that I get my furlough and that I see you once more before we leave. Red, I still want to marry you, even more now than I ever have before, but I can't marry you. Can't marry you now, darling. It won't be fair to you if I do. I love you, Anne, and I always shall as long as I live. But there's no use fooling ourselves. We are at war, and I might not come back, and I don't want to leave you a widow, maybe with a child, or with maybe a child." So he's breaking up with her. He concludes by saying, "Red, are you going to keep right on loving me, or are you going to forget about me when we are shipped away? I can't imagine how you are worrying right now, or I can imagine how you're worrying right now, but don't worry, everything will turn out all right. In another week or so, we should be able to tell whether or not we are going to get a furlough or not. I love you, Red, and I want to marry you, but there's a chance of not coming back or coming back a cripple. And I don't want to burden you. That's the last thing I want to do. Sweetheart, you and you alone will be the only woman in my heart as long as I live. I will come back to you, Red, never fear. Yours always, Sydney." So he did get a furlough about 3 weeks later. And Red, Anne, asked him basically, "What are you doing next week?" And he said, "Well, I'm going to spend it with you." And she said, "Good, because we're getting married." They got married. Now, he was a career military officer. He was not a colonel during World War II, but became one later. But he served in Korea. And he was a high enough rank that he was able to bring his wife over to Korea. And they had a child at that point. And they were in a Quonset hut in kind of a muddy area in Korea in the 1950s. And it was a rather dangerous place to be. And Anne had the choice of staying here in the United States or going to Korea. She learned how to fire a gun and carried a pistol so that she could be with her husband. She said, "We are not going to separate this family." So, strong-willed lady. Now, I remember, I think it was April 19th that she passed away, probably around 2005 or so. And one day I called him accidentally on April 19th, and he was in mourning every anniversary of her death because he outlived her. And gosh, he was dedicated to her. So, that story had a happy ending. But it shows that problem of relationships with a war when you serve for the duration. And when communications are not great. Now, this is a page out of Life magazine. And it was many pages, multiple pages. And Life magazine decided that, women, as you're writing your letters and putting kisses on your letters, and you can see here's one that one of my students was working with. It had a big red kiss on it. By the way, I don't know what they put in that lipstick in the 40s, but it's as vibrant today as it was 75 years ago. So, anyhow, Life magazine thought, well, you know what? The shape of your kiss could tell a message, okay? And they had 3 pages of different women puckering up and having these different shapes, and then explained what you were really saying with that kiss. And then I didn't copy the page, but on one of the other pages, it showed 3 kisses in a pattern, and that meant I love you, okay, those 3 kisses. So I just thought you'd appreciate that. Now your homework's going to be to go home and write somebody you care about. So I hope you realize, you're going to have homework today. Let's talk about censorship again. This is a letter that we have that you can see that a razor blade has removed part of the letter. Pete Weston was an interesting young man. He was not happy at home as a teenager, and he ran away. The family lived in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and he ran away to Detroit to work in the auto industry. Well, when the war broke out, he wanted to enlist, and they asked for his birth certificate. And when he left home, he did not take his birth certificate with him. So he wrote to his sisters. They had been estranged for about 3 years. And he wrote to them and said, I'm doing okay. I'm in Detroit working in the auto industry, and I need my birth certificate. And what's so nice is just that one request kindled or rekindled the relationship between Pete and his sisters. And he wrote to them regularly about his experiences in the military. And one thing that was kind of sad, maybe he remembered his sisters as being young girls, because he wrote to them like they were the dumbest people on earth. And we benefit from that. I don't mean it to be rude. He is so detailed in the letters for his sisters. I mean, it's incredible how detailed he is. But we benefit from that, except the censor really tore his letters apart. Okay, he's just so detailed. So he was always like, we have multiple letters of his, and they're all chopped up. This one was mild compared to several of his letters. But he's writing in this great detail. So he frequently wrote to his sisters in Pittsburgh, and his letters often did not pass the censor without a few cuts. Often here he would, like this one says, a fellow from blank told me. Well, apparently that gave something away, this fellow from blank. We don't know where he's from. Other times he'd write, hey, we just passed the island of blank on our ship, and that would get cut out. Other types of things that got cut out, if you just received vaccinations for like malaria, apparently malaria was prevalent in certain places, and saying, just got my vaccine for malaria, that was a clue that the enemy would know where you were headed, or narrow it down at least. They felt that if the enemy could figure out where you were, you weren't only risking your life, you were endangering the lives of maybe 2,000 men or more. So it was very important not to give any information away that the enemy could benefit from. Gotta go. I need to have Crystal, my assistant, come up here. Crystal, thank you for helping me today. I could just go, beep, and Crystal would do like the old slides. This is an example of a letter we have at the Virginia War Memorial that Clendon Pleasance wrote in March of 1942. And this is a great example of how right on one side of the page, which he did not, this is folded, so it was a 4-page letter, but he wrote on all 4 pages, and the censor had a field day with it. So here's the other side, just for the sake of argument. So yeah, just right on one side of the paper. Now, the government knew that people were using secret codes to get around censorship. And they put this article in the newspaper that warned you against what they were calling family codes. Now look, my mother is almost 85. She still likes to know when I get home in the evening, okay? I'll be 60 next year, but I'll always be her baby. Imagine if you're off at war. Of course, mom and dad want to know generally where you are and how you're doing, but you can't tell where you are. So they came up with some secret codes. One guy that I really loved, this one, he was going to the Pacific, and he numbered all the major places in the Pacific from like 1 to 40. And he said, look, I'm going to leave an identical map at home. I'm going to take one with me that matches, and I'm going to tell you what number I'm close to. Now, of course, if you wrote, Dear Mom and Dad, I'm next to island number 5 on the map I left you at home, he's going to get in some big trouble, right? That's not going to pass the censor. So here's what they would say. They'd say, you know what? Second paragraph, first sentence, I'm going to put a number in there. The sentence may not make any sense to you, but it'll tell you where to look on the map. It's always going to be the first sentence of the second paragraph. So he might get to the paragraph and say, wow, I can't believe I've been in the service, for 42 days this month. It wasn't that bad. I'm teasing there, but it would be a number. It might say like, oh, did Billy have a nice 6th birthday at home? And then there might not even be a Billy at home, or it might be their goat. The important thing was that number, and the censor wouldn't know if there was a Billy at home or not. The censor wouldn't know, so it would get through, and the parents would know to look for that sentence and that number. So that was pretty neat. I interviewed a man named Joe Black that lived here in Richmond, and he said that his parents accused him of never reading the letters they wrote because he never commented on anything they said. And one day they had a little farm, and they wrote to him and said, well, we just harvested, like 17 bushels of this, and 8 bushels of that, and 42 tomatoes, and how many squash. And they were very detailed. So when they complained that he wasn't reading the letters, he wrote back and said, so glad to hear about your 42 bushels of this and your whatever squash. Oh boy, the censor called him in and said, what's all this secret code you have? It wasn't secret code at all. He said it was 3 days they retained him until they believed him. He said he was practically crying that he was just trying to tell his parents that he'd actually read what they wrote, and they're like, nobody would write that in a letter. It was great. So he wasn't using a code, but got blamed for it for a while. So here we see that efforts to smuggle information through military channels are made by persons who do not stop to consider the loss of life and property that might result were their knowledge to reach an enemy agent. Family codes, so-called, are frequently used by servicemen and correspondents with families and friends to let those at home know where they are stationed and what they are doing. One code that we're going to look at here is really, this one's a really good one. I know it's blurry, but I'll explain it to you. He said, take the first letter of every paragraph, and that will spell where I am. Oh gosh, the enemy would never think of that, So here it is right here. Don't forget how I told you to know where I am when you get a letter. He says, take the first letter of every sentence, and that'll spell it out. Wow. So one of the things it said in the newspaper, you have to remember at home, I didn't include the map in this. I really should have. But if you look at the map of the world when Pearl Harbor was attacked, Germany had already overrun Europe from the English Channel all the way to the Moscow in the Soviet Union. They had a head start. They'd already taken over a continent, basically. They're in North Africa. Japan, if you listen to the president's speech, was an amazing speech on December 8th that Sid Wells was talking about. Japan had not only hit Pearl Harbor, but they had hit places all over the Pacific Rim. So now Japan has spread out throughout the Pacific, and now that we're entering the war, we are so far behind. Many of our guns were 1903 model. Our military was small. It was going to take a real national effort to win. And I think our enemies, Hitler was quoted as saying, Americans have no convictions they're willing to fight for, okay? And when we were so far behind in World War II from day one, I can understand why our enemies might have said, it's over, just cooperate with Japan, just cooperate with Germany, because there's no way we can defeat them with the head start they've had, okay? I would understand that, but we didn't do that. What did we do? We raised many of the ships at Pearl Harbor. That's what I tell students. What is it to be an American? We teach them that Pearl Harbor was attacked and many of our battleships were sunk, but we don't tell them that we raised most of those ships and sent them back into battle. That's what it is to be an American, to not give up when things look so bleak. But anyhow, I don't even remember why I'm telling you that at this point. Oh, I know what it is. Because our enemies had such an advantage, I think to make them not seem like Superman and seem like they were going to win, a lot of our media portrayed them in kind of comic ways. Remember, like, the Führer says that he's the master race, Sieg Heil in the Führer's face. They would do things like that to belittle our enemies. Well, all of a sudden, our government with letters started saying, look, I know we've been showing Tojo as like a cartoon character, but the Japanese are not as dumb as you think they are. They can figure out that the first letter of every paragraph spells where you are. So it was important to see that from the government, to take our enemies seriously. All right, one thing I didn't tell you about censorship has nothing to do with Fred Worrell, but I'll have to be careful because I know we're being recorded, but some people named things to get past the censor. So they wanted to be romantic with their partner, but they didn't want to spell it out, so to speak. So I better just stop there. But I will say this, we had a good 300 letters, not every letter, but in many of this one collection, about 300 letters, they had named their body parts as names, like, I won't tell you the names because some of you may have that name and it'll never be the same. So I didn't know. I thought they were people in their family. Until one day, this one person got a tick out in the field. And then I realized he wasn't talking. The way he worded it, I'm like, that's not a person, okay? But I had been reading those letters like you wouldn't believe until I figured out, okay? I will tell you, I know I shouldn't, but I'll tell you. The letters kept saying that Susie was acting up. And daggone if Susie didn't act up every month. And I thought, why don't they spank that child? Anyway, it turned out I finally realized that Susie wasn't a child. Okay, so these letters often have more information than you realize. I won't go any deeper than that. I think most of you are over 18, even though I'm educating youth today. But it was quite a shock when I realized that what I'd been reading wasn't what I thought I'd been reading in that collection of letters. This is my father-in-law and mother-in-law. They're both deceased now. They're both up in Arlington National Cemetery. And gosh, they liked each other a lot. I mean, they were really committed to each other. They grew up as teenagers in Newark, New Jersey. And Newark was a different time then. Fred said as a boy that the farmers would come in from the community with their fruit carts. They didn't have air conditioning, and the people on the second or third story windows would come and yell down, how much for cabbage, how much for strawberries? And as a child, he would run the strawberries up. The farmer wouldn't. He'd run up and give the fruit and vegetables, get the money, and run back down. And he worked at the bowling alley for a while at his church, and he had to set up the pins manually, okay, at this bowling alley. So, it was a different time. Now, Fred's parents liked each other a lot. He was one of 18 children. But television hadn't been invented yet, so, what are you going to do? Anyhow, but he really was. 5 of the first 6 were boys, and those 5 all went off to World War II. All 5 came home. His father died in 1942, or who knows how many more children they would have had. So he was one of 18. So here's Fred and Mary. He said he wanted girls, and sure enough, she gave him 4 daughters, and I married their youngest daughter. So he's the one that got me into the Battle of the Bulge organization. Well, here's a little bit that he wrote in the letter. I have a whole binder full of his letters, and he says just a few lines, and this is the day the Battle of the Bulge started. He said just a few lines to let you know I'm feeling fine, everything's all right with me. I'm now somewhere in France, and I have a few minutes to write this short letter. Darling, I love you with all my heart, and gee, I sure do miss you so very much. How's everyone at home? And then he says, today I received a letter from Paul, that's one of his brothers in the service, and he is somewhere in England. This was the only letter I received in 3 weeks, he named, I know you write to me, for there must be quite a delay in mail somewhere. And he was right, there was a huge delay in the mail. Please take very good care of your sweet self because I love you so very much, and I sure will be happy when the war is ended so I can come home to you. I love you so very, very much. Send my regards to the family and all down at work. Love, Daddy. And they called each other Mother and Daddy because they wanted to be parents so badly. They got married right after he got home from the war, and they were married for over 60 years before she passed away. So, this is one of James Goodwin's letters. He was from Chester, and he was in Italy in the Air Force. And he wrote to his fiancée Elizabeth, and this is just before Valentine's Day, 1945. And he says, "How's my Valentine tonight? Only 6 days, you know, so 6 more days till Valentine's Day. I received your sweet Valentine card, and it made me feel so good inside. To know that there is such a sweet and beautiful girl at home who cares is enough to lighten any man's heart." And here's a photo of his crew. He is over here, right here next to me. That's James Goodwin. And he says, "I now have 14 missions, finally gotten off the jinx." So the 13th mission they call the jinx. My last one was to Vienna again. We'll really have some experiences to tell you about when I see you again. So there's that reflection again. You know, he's at least telling how many missions he got it through where he'd gone, but you know, he has to wait till he gets home to give you the real details on his war experiences. Okay, V-mail. Now this is one of the coolest things that's ever been invented. Now most soldiers hated them, but I want you to think about this for a minute. We've already said that the mail is just about the most important thing to everybody serving. Well, mail takes up a lot of space in ships. A lot of space. Takes up a lot of space in planes. Space that we needed for equipment. Space that we needed for soldiers. And yet the government knew we can't not send the mail. We have to send it. So what are we going to do? Well, they came up with a great idea. They said, look, we'll take a photograph of the mail, and we'll get a whole reel of film, and we'll send the film across the ocean. And the mail, each little like 1 inch will be a letter on that film. And then when it gets to its destination, they'll print it out as a V-mail letter, a tiny letter. They reduce them in size and then deliver them. People didn't like how small they were. They were 1/4 the size of the original letter that was written. But the government said this, look, we've got letters that are going to the bottom of the ocean because the Japanese and the German submarines are sinking our ships that have the mail. When those letters go to the bottom of the ocean, those, you know, when they're down there, they're gone. No one will ever deliver those letters. V-mail, we hold the originals until we know that the film has made it across the ocean. And then if that ship gets sunk with the film, we refilm and send it again. So the government said, look, we know you don't like the small version, but it's the only 100% guaranteed delivery of your letters that we can give you. That helped a lot of people. Still, a lot of people didn't use it, but a lot did. I saw a photograph, I don't think I included it in this, but it showed a man with the post office, and he had 37 bags of mail in a stack, and he had 1 bag of film. And the 1 bag of film equaled the 37 bags of mail. So that was how they worked out saving space on ships and guaranteeing the mail to be delivered. So this talks about V-mail. This was a government-issued poster showing a lady writing on the original V-mail form. It says, V-mail is private, reliable, and patriotic. And here we see the soldiers at mail call. So this is what it looked like from a size perspective. The original V-mail sheet was normal, like 8.5 by 11, and it was it had the red color, and you had to stay within the lines. If you went outside the lines, they wouldn't film it. Okay, so they have little red lines along here, and you had to stay within those. Once the original, was filmed and then printed, this is how it came out. So you can see that about 4 of these will fit on one of the originals. So that's how tiny they were, and people didn't really care for that. They were black and white, and just not easy to read, but it made sense to do this. Here's a couple examples. Some V-mail were pre-printed so that a whole bunch of soldiers could send a fancy one for Mother's Day 1945. And this was for soldiers in the China, Burma, India theater. So, all you had to do was sign it or write a little note at the bottom, and it was already functioning as a Mother's Day card. Because it turned out there weren't a lot of stores where they were fighting to buy a Mother's Day card, okay? So that helped. So that's V-mail, which stood for Victory Mail. These are some patriotic covers. I love patriotic covers. And you know, the Spanish-American War had "Remember the Maine." That was the slogan about the USS Maine. Well, of course, the World War II slogan was "Remember Pearl Harbor." And it was on ashtrays and jewelry and envelopes. I mean, that slogan appeared all over the United States. So here we see a couple envelopes, you know, "Remember Pearl Harbor" on this one. And this one is also an envelope. You can see it was canceled in 1943, but I just cropped out the part that shows a battleship and it says "Remember Pearl Harbor." By the way, on the table over there, I brought several samples of letters that I want to tell you about as we conclude. And one of them is a letter that was written on the USS Arizona in March of 1941. I know all of you know that the Arizona is our memorial that is still on the bottom of Pearl Harbor, still leaking oil, and the entire crew, I believe, of over 1,000 men. I say the entire crew, that's not quite true. Some did survive, but the crew is still on board that was killed that day. I've been told that men who live to be older, that survived the war, are permitted to be buried on the ship with their shipmates. Okay? This is another one I really like. Oh, this is telling me a lot of interesting things. You know, "It shall be done." So here we see the Nazi flag, the Italian flag, and the Japanese flag, so the Axis powers. And this always represents liberty, like the Statue of Liberty. And liberty has a dagger or a sword that's piercing through our enemies. It says, "It shall be done." But what I love about this is the stamp. Do you notice anything wrong with the stamp? It's upside down. Now, I was always told an upside down stamp means "I love you." Okay, so not only did they love them enough for the upside down stamp, but the aerial stamp was put on upside down too. I mean, this is exuding love, okay? I don't know if you realize that or not. And if you look at the date, February 9th, you know, it's just a few days before Valentine's Day. So just love, love, love. You know, nothing says love like stabbing the Axis powers, okay? So there we are. Here's a couple, you know, Winston Churchill was big for V for victory. And there he is greeting a crowd, giving the V symbol. And here you can see the influence on our patriotic covers, you know, being an envelope, on to "Victory for Liberty." And there's the searchlights making the V, and the airplane in the background, and tanks behind "Liberty," you know, with the V for victory. So it's a very patriotic envelope that was used. Well, this one was unused, but could have been used. This is one of my favorites from 1943 that shows Mussolini, Hitler, and Tojo. And the train is the United Nations, which is interesting because the United Nations, as we know it, didn't exist quite yet. But the United Nations are clearing the tracks of these, you know, dictators, which I think is pretty cool. And again, this reflects what I was saying earlier, this cartoonishness. You know, we started seeing these enemy leaders in a cartoonish way. I think that helped ease our stress a little bit, you know, because like I said, if you looked at the map and saw what they had taken over and what they were doing, you'd have been so intimidated you would have just wanted to hide under your bed. So we start seeing them a little bit cartoon-like. This is a really good example, exaggerated, but this is Tojo, and it says "Bonds by Bombs." And there's a bomb exploding at Tojo's behind, and he's not very, you know, big teeth and small eyes, and it's not very flattering. This is one of my favorites. Hitler's being attacked by Russia, and it says "The man with the bear behind." And the bear has torn Hitler's pants. It says Adolf on his pants. So yeah, it's the man with the bear behind. So again, trying to belittle our enemies a little bit in the mail. Here's a nice one, "Our pledge, liberty and justice for all." And there's the globe with the Statue of Liberty torch in the background. Here's one. We issued stamps in 1943 commemorating some of the nations that were occupied by our enemies. And Luxembourg is one of those. And it says, "Luxembourg, crushed but will live again." And you know, you may not know that the story of Luxembourg is actually really fascinating in that the Germans sent what they called a fifth column of soldiers disguised as civilians into Luxembourg. And they drifted across Luxembourg to the border with Luxembourg and France. And when it was time to attack, these civilians or tourists suddenly had lots of weapons and began to prevent the people of Luxembourg from retreating into France. Duchess Charlotte was the leader of Luxembourg, and her motorcade had 5 cars in it that tried to escape into France as the Nazis were pouring in. And they were met by this fifth column that opened fire on the motorcade. 4 of the cars did not make it out of Luxembourg. The one that did had Charlotte on board. so she escaped. She was brought back to the United States. President Roosevelt had her come. She toured the U.S. and talked about the importance, this was in 1940 when this happened, talked about the importance of the United States supporting those countries for freedom in Europe, especially Luxembourg. So, all right, this is Lieutenant Herbert J. Silcox of the 38th Armored Infantry Battalion. And this is a letter from his dad on March 11, 1945. And it says, received your welcome letter dated February 23rd. It shows that delay of about 2.5 weeks in the mail. Glad to hear you're getting along fine. We're reading about the good job you were doing and hope it will be over soon. Yesterday we worked in the yard. Seemed like spring, but was still rather cold. We all wish you the best and send lots of love right when you can, Dad. What a sweet letter from Dad, only to be returned to Dad marked deceased. Dad lived on Nottoway Avenue in Richmond, and that's how he found out his son had been killed in combat. Lieutenant Silcox died instantly on the 29th of March, 1945 in Kirchen, Germany, as a result of shell fragment wounds of the head. No further details were given. Sincerely yours, Edward Witzel, Major General, Adjutant General of the Army. So he was killed in combat. Just to back it up for a second, and there you can see the photo of him. So. Here's the, I should have had this earlier, but this is Paige writing about baseball. It says, I wish you could have been here with me today listening to the World Series. Remember they played all the games in the daytime back then. Now you have to stay up for like a day and a half to watch the games on TV. But yeah, I wish you could have been here with me today listening to the World Series. After thinking the Dodgers were practically a cinch to win, the St. Louis Cardinals came from behind to place first. The Yankees feel quite at home playing in the World Series. So it's the Cardinals and the Yankees in the 1942 World Series. Jeanette Cook to Carlton Cook in 1942. I always have you in my heart and mind, darling. We must both look forward with faith and with the belief that someday soon we will have peace again and you will be back safely. We invaded North Africa on November 8th, and Carlton went into North Africa. He did survive the war, which is good, but the important thing here is he's writing in 1942 that hopefully we'll have peace again soon, and we know he's going to be gone for 3 more years. Okay, so it's not going to happen soon. Ike Lipton wrote to Louise Ray. They were dating. She was a college girl, which you often didn't have back then. And Ike writes on the left, I am safe. That is all I can say. Write to me if you have time to. Whether you got a letter from me or not, I'll be seeing you every day in my dreams. You can use that line if you want. That's a good one. He says, goodbye till I see you again, Ike Lipton, early 1940. He didn't date the letter. He was dating Louise Ray, but he wasn't dating his letter. So that's a picture of Ike there at the bottom that Louise carried for many years. You can see that it's faded and yellowed and a little dirty. She carried that thing for a long time in her purse. What's interesting is with the letter collection, we found the other half. This was half a photo, there was another person in it. And because that other half wasn't carried, it was pristine, it looked great, it was clean. But this one, because it was so worn and faded, you just knew it had been in a purse or wallet for a very long time. Well, Louise writes, I was really glad to hear from you. I don't hear very often, but it really seems good when I do hear. I hope you weren't hurt very much. War is terrible, but still, we back home can't realize what it is. Louise Ray on April 17, 1945. Before I go on to Dudley, you remember the envelope that Silcox received that said deceased? Louise got the same envelope. Okay, when she said here, I hope you weren't hurt very much and war was terrible, he died from his wounds. And what I love about it is, again, she carried that picture for decades. It was really impressive. I know we're almost out of time, so I can just tell you real quick, this is a letter from Dudley Mabey, or from his dad. Dudley dies in a training accident here in the United States. He's a bombardier. He did not want to kill people with his bombs, but he loved taking control of the plane, as the bombardiers would do. And what this says, it's a beautiful letter. The father is writing to a young woman who's just joined the Women's Army Corps. And he says, I was pretty sure that this war would cost us our oldest boy when it started in Europe back in 1939. It was just a matter of figuring out arithmetically. When he chose the branch of service he did, it was all the more certain. I went through a small measure of this when he was here on leave, and even months before he knew he would be successful in completing his training. War is a cruel, coercive thing. It destroys human values as well as industrial plants. It does things to us no matter whether we are in uniform or not. Greed is the fundamental cause of it all. Greed killed a boy without a vicious impulse in him. Greed will kill many more. I am bitter. This business of being proud of a casket with a flag on it is not the kind of thing I go for. Dudley didn't hate anything but his bombardiering. He knew what his bombs would do, and he did not like it. He liked his navigation, though. He was willing to talk at length about it, but never about his bombardiering. He didn't hate even the Japs, but he had the courage to carry on, even to grin. We are glad that he never had to kill anyone. And he goes on with detail. I don't know whether Mrs. Carlson told you any of the details, but Dudley was one of 5 men killed when his plane refused to take off at Scott Field in St. Louis at 8:17 a.m. on September 18th. 1 man in the tail of the plane came out alive but badly hurt. They had flown from Lake Charles, Louisiana the day before and spent the night there. The Army says apparently mechanical failure. So be it. He was crushed. The plane, I think, weighs about 17 tons and has to get well above 100 miles per hour to take off. It was the B-26 Marauder. His choice, because he could navigate. He told us that when he was navigating, he was so busy on takeoffs that he scarcely knew when the plane left the ground. He was buried in Boulder Green Mountain Cemetery late in the afternoon of September 21st. He was presentable in his casket, but scarcely the boy we saw leave only a few weeks earlier. He was in the next to last week of his combat crew training. We're all right. Don't give it a thought. Go on about your business. You've got a job ahead of you. Accept a little of the courage these fellows leave us when they die, and carry on, soldier. I am including a picture of him. If this bothers you, Jackie, throw it away. You didn't know him, and after all, he's only one of many. But he was the one for me. I'm proud of his fine, sensitive courage, not his death. That's damnable. But how I hate the thing that killed him. Doug wouldn't like me to write like this about him. I'm out of paper, and I'm not at the cabin. Write about yourself. Yours, Zell F. Maybe. And the newspaper article identified the names of everyone killed in the crash. This was in the Washington Evening Star. And I put the tombstone here because it says a 6th crew member, Corporal Sam Berlotti of St. Louis, is in serious condition in the post hospital. He was the only survivor. And this is Sam Berlotti's tombstone. Remember, the plane crashed in what, 1944, I think it was? Date of death, October 14th, 1995. He married, he had a family, he survived. So that's a happy story, at least, that Sam Berlotti did live a decent life. I could go on. I need to stop because I'm keeping you here. So I will just tell you the medics, their letters are impressive because I spoke last night at the VFW in Mechanicsville about medics and nurses. And we don't think about what they went through. Every 3 hours, patients got injections for penicillin. When the enemy line kept shifting with the Battle of the Bulge, those hospitals, the generators, the equipment, the medicine, the patients, all had to be moved. Moved in 1944 to 45 in the worst winter in about 30 years in Europe. Ice and snow everywhere, temperatures below zero. And finally, this one medic, Jack King, writes and says, you know, he's angry. And he's like, I would give anything to have a normal day, to go out on a date. You know, I'm just sick of this. And he does say that they've moved about 6 times. They moved the field hospital in a span of about 11 days because the German lines kept changing so rapidly. So these are just a few of Jack's letters that I'll just leave it at that about him. Here's some pictures of the nurses, and Jack's up at the top. And Jack's talking about Christmas. They had a turkey dinner. He was very appreciative of that. And then he talks about the letter finally arriving, and he says, the mail gets messed up for a while. It will straighten out soon, I hope. And the whole theme, you may have noticed, is the mail's been slow. It's been messed up. Here's the solution. The The mail had gotten so backed up that there were 6 airplane hangars, giant airplane hangars filled with mail and packages in England that hadn't been delivered. The government sent the 688 Postal Directory Battalion under Major Charity Adams. It's the only all-black, all-female unit that ever served overseas during World War II. They started to put a white officer over it, and Charity Adams was brave enough to go to the commanding officer and say, absolutely not, I will take care of these ladies. And he backed down and sent Charity Adams in charge of the ladies, about 800 ladies, to figure out the mail situation. This is just, they just received the Congressional Gold Medal. There are about 7 still living. And this just talks about the ladies being in the WAC. But what's so important, in Eleanor Roosevelt and Mary McLeod Bethune, they were instrumental in making sure these ladies got to go serve. This is Mabel Ortiz, and one of those, she was Hispanic, but seen as colored or black, even though she was Hispanic. And she's sitting on some of those mail bags in one of those airplane hangars. What's so amazing is they had 6 months to solve the problem. And here's some of the problems they dealt with. It said as Allied forces drove across Europe, the ever-changing locations of service members hampered the delivery of mail, because 7 million civilians and military personnel from the United States served in the Eastern Theater of Operations. Many had identical names. For example, 7,500 individuals were named Robert Smith. Imagine getting mail for 7,500 different Robert Smiths. And they had to figure that out. One general predicted that the backlog in Birmingham, England would take 6 months to process, and the lack of reliable mail was hurting morale. And we could already see how important the mail was. Well, it took them 3 months around the clock. And they processed, this is great, in one shift, the women processed an average of 65,000 pieces of mail per shift and cleared the 6-month backlog within 3 months. When you read the soldiers' letters, they don't know about these ladies, but by March 1945, you get letters that say things like, I got 10 letters today, 3 from you and 2 from mom. And they didn't know that the backlog was broken because of these ladies, the 688, working around the clock to make sure that backlog got broken. So, that's it. You made it. Congratulations. So, any questions before I walk away? So.